Hello, I'm Adam Markham. I'm the Deputy Director for Climate and Energy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'm going to give this presentation on climate change impacts on cultural heritage for the CVI-Africa project. It's been nearly 15 years since UNESCO's first report on climate change and world heritage, and I highly recommend this, and I've linked to it in the resources for the course. This is a series of case studies which are still very relevant today on how climate change might be predicted to harm World Heritage sites. So climate change is now the fastest growing threat to World Heritage sites globally. And we're going to be looking at what that means. So is there a World Heritage site that's not impacted by climate change? Probably not. Are there World Heritage sites that are more at risk than others? Absolutely. But we need to understand the risks and take action locally and internationally. And that means really looking at what does climate change mean for World Heritage sites. We face an unpredictable future for World Heritage sites. We can't any longer rely on the climate and weather patterns of the recent past for planning our management in the future. In the United States, all national parks in the coastal areas are now having to plan for hurricanes and storms that are at least one category higher than they've ever historically experienced in the past. We also will see widespread degradation of outstanding universal value of World Heritage properties. We'll probably see the loss of OUV in some cases, and that may mean that some sites will have to be removed from the World Heritage list. Climate change exacerbates and adds to existing threats. So where we already have pressures from tourism, urbanization, resource extraction, or conflict, climate change just makes that worse. And so we need to look at climate change not as a single pressure, but as something that adds to existing pressures. And then finally, we're going to have major new management and interpretation challenges. We need people who come to our sites to be able to understand what climate change means for these World Heritage properties, and our managers and site managers need to also integrate climate change and climate science into their work in the future. In 2016, I was involved in leading a UNESCO project to look at new case studies of sites in 29 countries, including 5 in Africa, that were affected by climate change. The African sites included Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania, Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda, the Cape Floral region in South Africa, Lake Malawi National Park in Malawi, and the ancient Ksur in Mauritania. And this was a project that really looked at how was climate change going to affect these sites, but also how was it exacerbating tourism impacts, and how would it affect tourism? Because tourism is a key part of World Heritage, and yet over-tourism or uncontrolled tourism is also negatively affecting World Heritage sites. That UNESCO report looked at both natural and cultural sites, and indeed mixed sites, but as we're talking mainly about cultural heritage in this course, I did want to emphasize that although some sites are only listed for their natural attributes and values, most of those, if not all of those, natural sites also have cultural heritage values. They're just not listed as amongst the values or the OUV for those particular sites. And so I think it's very important to recognize that natural sites have cultural values. So I just wanted to make that point early on. So what does climate change mean for World Heritage sites? I'm going to give you a few broad scale examples. Here, for example, is a study that was done of World Heritage coral reefs back in 2017 and 2018. And it shows that 25 of 29 World Heritage properties experienced bleaching stress. That's death of the corals due to warm waters, some of them twice or more. And under future climate scenarios, most of these will severely bleach twice per decade by 2040. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the premier global scientists group assessing climate change threats and impacts, says that 90% of living coral reefs will be lost if we don't hit the 1.5 degrees centigrade target that came to agreement under the Paris Agreement. And so if we don't hit that Paris target, we will lose many of the world's coral reefs. Those coral reefs are central to many World Heritage Sites. They're important for the economy in many of the countries in which they exist, and they're vital to local people who use them for fisheries and for food and protein. So the loss of coral reefs is a complete disaster if we experience it as a result of climate change. Another study in 2019 looked at World Heritage glaciers, and it showed that 21 of 46 World Heritage glaciers could be lost by 2100. That includes the Ruwenzori and Kilimanjaro glaciers in Africa. And so this is a real threat to important natural and cultural sites. Also in the colder zones, a recent review of Arctic archaeology showed that more than 180,000 archaeological sites might be at risk in the Arctic region, and that includes several World Heritage properties. There's a problem with the thawing of permafrost and the warming of soil, which is accelerating the rate of decomposition of organic materials in the soil, and then also loss of sea ice, which protects the coast against erosion, and without the sea ice, the winter storms are tearing away, sometimes meters at a time, of coastal sites. So Arctic archaeology is highly under threat from climate change. Another 2019 study of World Heritage properties and climate change looked at Mediterranean sites on the coasts and found that 42 of 49 of them have been identified as already at risk from some level of coastal erosion, and the same is true of sea level rise. So we see several of these sites are in North Africa, for example. Now I want to mention another report from ICOMOS, from the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group, which was published a couple of years ago, called The Future of Our Pasts: Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Action. You'll probably hear about this in several of the modules, and several of the instructors in this course were involved in putting this first-of-its-kind report together. One of the conclusions from the report was that climate change impacts must become a baseline competency of heritage management, as are already sustainable development principles. And that's really one of the precepts of the course that we are working on now, because we're trying to increase climate knowledge and understanding amongst heritage professionals. The Future of Our Pasts is a report that it's very useful to come back to, because it talks not just about the kinds of impacts that might be experienced, but also how heritage management can change in the face of climate change. For the purposes of this course, I draw your attention to part 2 of the report, the ICOMOS report, which has a very detailed assessment of expert knowledge on what the kinds of impacts that various typologies of heritage might experience. And the 6 categories that ICOMOS identified was movable heritage, including museums and collections, archaeological resources, buildings and structures, cultural landscapes, which includes urban landscapes, parks and gardens, associated communities and traditional communities, and finally, but also very, very importantly, intangible heritage. And while we're on lists, I'd like to draw your attention to this list of the climate stressors which are used in the Climate Vulnerability Index assessments. You'll hear a lot more about the CVI later in this course, but because we're talking about climate science and climate impacts today, it's useful to have this list. On the left-hand column, you see the names of the climate stressors, and these are the ones that participants in CVI workshops are asked to prioritize amongst when they discuss what the main threats or the main risks to the sites they're evaluating are. And so you will see this list often again, but it's a great compilation of the types of climate change impacts that heritage can be vulnerable to. So what are some of the direct impacts of climate change? Let's look at impact on buildings, for example. On the right you see historic Cairo, and on the left Asmara, which is a colonial city in Eritrea. But buildings throughout Africa will be affected in the same way they are throughout the world. So we're looking at things like changes in precipitation and more rain damage from extreme rainfall, changes in the freeze-thaw cycle, which can damage building materials, stone flaking from chemical and temperature changes, more abrasion by the wind damaging buildings, corrosion of metals, increased biological degradation such as fungus and bacteria damaging wood, and salt crystallization, which can damage all types of stone and masonry. Outside of the larger and more modern cities of Africa, there are many earthen buildings and a lot of ancient masonry, and so it's worth having a particular look at that. Here's two sites, Wadan in Mauritania and Kutamaku in Togo. And the kinds of impacts that these types of buildings would see is damage and erosion from extreme precipitation, damage from change in the freeze-thaw cycle if they're in areas that have freezes, increased maintenance cost and frequency of having to do that maintenance, particularly in the earthen buildings. And then an issue which has also been associated with climate change is sand dune migration, and so being inundated by sand in some of the Sahelian region and Sahara Desert region building areas, for example. And another example of the types of damage that buildings can experience comes from Angkor, the World Heritage Site in Cambodia, with its many buildings and temples. This is an interesting example because it's a combination of climate change and tourism. So you're seeing destabilization of some of these buildings due to land subsidence, and that's caused by changes in the rainfall patterns, mainly decreasing rainfall, but then greater water extraction due to increasing tourism development because of the number of visitors that come to Angkor every year. And so the combination of water extraction and less rainfall, particularly if the seasonal rainfall changes, can cause land subsidence, and that in turn brings cracks and damage to buildings. And so as the numbers of tourists increase at Angkor, then so does the demand for water and the changes in the soil as a result of that. So this is an example of kind of the exacerbation of an existing problem, either by climate change or mass tourism. Moving on to sea level rise, which most people know about as one of the primary impacts of climate change. Here are just a couple of examples from Africa. On the left we have Sabratha, the Roman city right on the coast in Libya, and you can see in the bottom photograph areas of that archaeological ruin are already being lost to sea level rise. And on the right, Goree Island, which is one of the sites of conscience as a memorial to the Atlantic slave trade. This fort and the island itself are highly threatened by sea level rise, as are many, many other islands in Africa. Associated with sea level rise is also worsened coastal flooding and higher and worse storm surges. And this is an example of Hoi An in Vietnam, another World Heritage Site. The historic district contains at least 800 16th and 17th century wooden buildings. Nearby beaches are eroding at up to 20 meters per year, and this whole area has been projected to be severely inundated every year within a decade. And so this is the kind of catastrophic damage to historic coastal towns that we are likely to see much more often. But it isn't just flooding on the coast. Rivers also flood once we get extreme rainfall. Two examples on the right, you can see Paris, France in 2016, where the Louvre museum was shut down because of flooding, and paintings had to be moved from the basement because they were afraid they would lose them. There was all sorts of impacts on this World Heritage City. You move to a drier area on the left, the Meroe Pyramids in Sudan. These are also at risk from riverine flooding. They're very close to the Nile River, and increased extreme rainfall is increasing the risk of flooding for these ancient monuments in Sudan. Coastal erosion, too, increases with both sea level rise and worsened storms. This is just an aerial shot of an Iron Age settlement in Orkney, Scotland. This is the Broch of Gurness. It's actually protected by a seawall, but it's a nice photograph that shows you how erosion can cut away at archaeological sites. And there are literally tens of thousands of coastal archaeological sites around the world that are at threat from this kind of erosion. I haven't yet talked about wildfires, but increasing heat and drier soils, longer dry seasons are resulting in larger wildfires and more damaging wildfires in many parts of the world. Here's some examples from World Heritage Sites and national parks. The Tasmanian Wilderness in Australia, where it is a fire-adapted ecosystem, but it's been experiencing much more extreme fires, which some of the ecosystems will not be able to recover from. And then in the top right, you see Bandelier National Monument in the US after a fire, with the rocks there are an indigenous settlement from the 16th century, 14th to 16th century, pretty much destroyed by the fire. And then one of the results after fires is increased flooding and erosion from extreme rainfall. So wildfires cause damage themselves, and then afterwards it makes flooding and erosion much more likely. Even without fires, increased erosion caused by extreme rainfall events can be a really big problem. This is just one example from the Salou Archaeological Park in Oman. You can see the two pictures on the left show gullying and undermining of stone walls or masonry walls after extreme rainfall. Even in this very dry area, when the rains come, they're coming increasingly hard, and that will cause real management problems for many archaeological sites. Africa is very well known for its extraordinary rock art, and rock art is one of the types of heritage which can be particularly damaged by certain types of climate change. So we might think of fire damage causing flaking or spalling on rocks with art. We might see more wind abrasion, and in some places we'll see more biological damage if there's increased humidity, causing more microbial growth. So rock art is one of the areas to really keep a look at. There's also chemical changes to the pigments where pigments are involved, and so that also can be very damaging. Underwater archaeology too is at risk from climate change. We are expecting to see shifting sediments and changing currents which may move archaeological remnants on the seabed. Ocean acidification will increasingly damage limestone-based archaeological sites, and in certain parts of the world there'll be increased damage to wood from the shipworms, which are able to expand their range into warmer waters as those oceans warm. And inland, changing lake levels can expose archaeological sites that have been underwater and protected by the lack of oxygen. They can expose them, and then those sites can start being lost or damaged as a result of being out of the water. So now I want to come to climate impact on intangible heritage, an incredibly important part of this whole discussion, and one that I hope we'll dig into more during the rest of the course. Just to give a few examples, and you can see more of these if you look at the impacts pages of the ICOMOS Future of Our Pasts report. Changes to seasonal harvests, for example, or when one can hunt traditionally hunted or harvested species. Have they changed their ranges? Are they still migrating at the same time? Another one is impediments, particularly heat, to rituals or traditional festivals. Loss of traditional materials that might be used for buildings or costumes. Loss of meaning in traditional or sacred places, and I think there's a lot of examples with indigenous people in the United States that are already experiencing that, and I'm sure there are in Africa too. Another one is loss or addition of words to describe climate or traditions. New climate changes or climate conditions require people to have new ways to describe them. But if the climate changes, they may forget the old ways of describing what used to happen. And connected to that is that traditional stories may no longer have an identifiable place in them if those places disappear or change. And then finally, migration to urban areas resulting in loss of knowledge and cultural practices. As we come to the end of this particular presentation, I'd like to just identify a few lessons to take forward for our future discussions of heritage management strategies. So I think something that will become clear throughout this course is we need to use the best available climate science, but that may be different in different places, so we always need to reach out and try to talk to local climate scientists, find out what the local academic institutions are, look at the global assessments, but using the best available climate science is key. Then we need to assess and understand climate risk and vulnerability, and really that is the core of the CVI process. Having done that, we need to integrate climate change into planning, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that during the course. We need to manage for change, not just static conditions. In the past, people have said, well, it'll probably be like it is on average today, but that's not the case for the future because of climate change. And in that sense, we need to embrace uncertainty, but also plan for the most plausible scenarios. Don't necessarily plan for the worst case scenario. Look at the climate models, try to understand what's happening, and look at the most plausible scenarios to put your planning and management resources into. Critical to integrate local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge for many, many reasons, but one particular reason is that often traditional knowledge has a much more fine and nuanced understanding of climatic variables in a place than modern science can bring to that. So the two together can be a very great force. And then finally, develop strategies for sustainable tourism and also climate interpretation at sites. World Heritage sites are places that tourists visit, that people locally visit, and so tourism needs to be non-damaging and sustainable, and that needs to be integrated into climate management and planning too. We've nearly come to the end of the presentation, but I just wanted here to put up a slide that shows the project partners and the funders for the CVI-Africa project. I want to thank you for watching the presentation. I very much look forward to talking to you more during the course, and I hope that we'll have much more detailed conversations about some of these impacts. My contacts are on this slide. Thank you very much. Goodbye.